See you. Yeah. And I think like it was not a part of it. Yeah.
Not because it's
Yeah, no way. And there's a lot of They were great. I haven't taken like a deep look at them, but it's a very photogenic bunch. And a lot of them were like, you know, like they were doing very like good photos.
I guess did like some like rapid clips. I was like, oh, we almost be doing like a real.
Yeah. Well, if you don't do that when people are talking, you get the like photo. You want the laptop is the super savvy.
Hi, everyone. We are going to get started, and we're going to get started with Professor Duncan McHugh, who's going to be doing a land acknowledgement. So I'll ask Professor McHugh to come up and join us.
Ani Kinagwea, Onkwadons Indigenous Cas, Maingan Ned Dodem, Chippewas, Georgina Island and Donjaba, Anishinaabe Indal, Oos Indal, Gwis Indal, and Buzzgim Indal. Apchago Miigwechwen Dan, Ayayon Mompi, Anishinaabe Ake. Apchago Gitchinen Dum. Apchago Miigwechwen Dan, Anishinaabek Kidgan Zibe, Minwa Pikwaknagan, Ayayon Mompi, Ottawa Ing. For those of you who, your Anishinaabemowin may be a little bit rusty, I just said hey. Trish leaned over to me at the beginning and said, keep it short. So this will only be about 20 minutes or so. We are, of course, I would hope that everybody now knows that we are on the traditional lands, the unceded traditional lands of the Algonquins and Anishinaabeg peoples, particularly the Kitigan-Zibi First Nation, which is about a 2-hour drive from here, and the Pikwaknagan First Nation, which is about an hour and 50 minutes north of here by Algonquin Park. And so we give thanks for being in this territory as they are in the midst of negotiating their land claim. And we give thanks to be part of their community, because that is what we are here at Carleton University. I am going to take an extra couple of minutes, though, because it's one thing to give a land acknowledgement, which I would hope that many of us do here at Carleton University. But it being the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, I see that many of you are wearing your orange t-shirts today, and that just fills me with joy, because I hope you know the story behind the orange t-shirts and how there was one student who went to school and had that shirt taken away from her. And it symbolizes for us the hardships that our ancestors went through and the hardships that our communities are still going through. So I thank you for taking time today to recognize and acknowledge the work that we have to do as a country in terms of reconciling with Indigenous peoples on our own lands. But again, I would ask you to do more than just wear an orange t-shirt. I got swamped with emails over the past month or so saying, Duncan, what can I do? People who are CBC listeners who want to show and acknowledge the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, but they don't know what to do. They may have listened to the Cooper Island podcast, for example, and they send me notes and say, what can I do to reconcile? So here's a couple of tips if you're asking that same question on this particular day. How much can you say Anin for me? Anin. You're saying hello, Anin. Or in a northwestern dialect, Bojo. 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 You're saying hello. Miigwech. Miigwech. So, Ani and Miigwech. You're saying hello and thank you. When I go across the border and go into Gatineau, I say bonjour, salut, and I say merci beaucoup, just as a courtesy to acknowledge of the language of the people in the province of Quebec. Likewise, when you're in Anishinaabe territory and you meet an Anishinaabe person, it's okay to say Ani or Miigwech. Okay, so words to remember. How many of you like music? Okay, awesome. So take out your, like right now, while you're wasting time listening to me, take out your phone and follow 5 Indigenous musicians. And if you don't have, like, Google Indigenous musician and follow 5, and they'll get 0.00001 cent every time you listen to one of their songs, okay? That's so, and Jeremy Dutcher just won the Polaris Prize. Alyssa P., one of my favorites, 2 recommendations. How many of you like to read? Awesome. So Tanya Talaga right now is on the national bestseller list for her book, The Knowing. Go out and get it. Wabgijik rice, moon of the crusted snow, moon of the falling leaves. Two of my friends, but go out and buy their books. Have a book club that you talk and discuss Indigenous books. How many of you like hockey? I'm thinking of you, Professor Boswell. If you like hockey, there are Indigenous hockey players out there. Brandon Montour hoisted the cup in 6 Nations this year. Learn a little bit more about the Indigenous hockey players who are playing in the NHL, including some on the Ottawa Senators. I will leave it to you to find out who those people are. Whatever your area of interest, I guarantee you there is a way to connect with the Indigenous community and build relationships with them. That is doing the work of reconciliation, building relationships with your Indigenous neighbors. Miigwech. I am so thrilled to have been asked and honored to be starting off this talk of my very dear friend, one of the best producers that I have ever had the opportunity to work with at CBC News. I know that you guys are going to be astounded by what she has to say today. Miigwech.
Welcome, and thank you so much. I'm Trish Odette-Longo, an assistant professor in the School of Journalism and Communication, and I am so pleased to welcome award-winning journalist and educator Pacinthe Mattar to deliver a special keynote lecture for the very first time here at Carleton University. It's called Objectivity, Press Freedom, and the Palestine Exception. I began to imagine this event this summer, shortly after Pacinthe had returned to Canada from participating in a Marianne Shag Carey Center Fellowship for Black journalists that included attending the National Association of Black Journalists Convention in the United States. You may have seen some of that coverage or clips posted on social media after former US President Donald Trump appeared on stage. Pacinthe published a piece in The Walrus entitled, "Donald Trump Insulted a Room Full of Black Journalists. I Was There." And in this piece, she wrote, "At its root, journalism is about witnessing and documenting, accurately, unflinchingly, the first draft of history. And one of the core principles of objectivity is not that it is a personal quality, but a discipline of verification, a method of working against one's biases by acknowledging them and challenging them in one's coverage." This piece is a companion 4 years later to her essay, Objectivity is a Privilege Afforded to White Journalists, which is now taught in journalism classes at this university and many others. Pacinthe's work dredges up questions about race, practice, privilege, and precarity in newsrooms. I invited Pacinthe to Carleton's journalism program to meet with students in my graduate class, which is called Journalism in a Changing Society, today, and to meet with all of you tonight. Pacinthe is an Egyptian-Canadian journalist, writer, producer, host, and journalism instructor based in Toronto. She spent 10 years at the CBC producing for national TV and radio programs. Her work focuses on race and racism, Middle East politics, and more, and has been published in The Walrus, Al Jazeera, Chatelaine, and Toronto Life, and many other places. In 2021, she received a National Magazine Award and Canadian Online Publishing Award for her feature essay, Objectivity is a Privilege Afforded to White Journalists. She was selected as a 2022 Fellow at the Neiman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. In 2023, she was the Asper Fellow in Media at Western University. She's the host of the monthly Dawn Talks series at the Dawn Arts Academy in Toronto. She's taught journalism and writing at Western University, Boston University, and Harvard University. She earned her undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto at Mississauga in 2008 and completed a master's degree in journalism from Toronto Metropolitan University in 2010. This event was made possible with the support from the School of Journalism and Communication and Director Alan Thompson and Jamie Sidegrove, who you'll see over there. After Pacinthe's lecture, members of the Student-Led Association for Equity and Inclusion in Journalism and Media will be joining us on stage for a question and answer panel. And if you have questions along the way, please use that Sli.do. Just submit throughout the night, and I'll be keeping an eye on those. In journalism schools, we prepare emerging reporters with the skills that we know they will need in their careers and in the world. How to start with a question, find answers, produce a story. How to carefully listen to people and earn their trust and the trust of the people in our communities. We also have opportunities to think outside of our practices or outside of the practices that we know. At a school of journalism, we can ask critical questions about potential change, listen closely to multiple perspectives, and weigh carefully how to do things differently. Please join me in welcoming Pacinthe Mattar.
Assalamu alaikum, marhaba, bienvenue. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. It is so beautiful to see such a packed room. I feel like I'm towering over you, but I'm very short behind this podium. So thank you, Professor Duncan McHugh, for the honor of the land acknowledgement, especially on this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Many of us owe a debt to Indigenous people and Indigenous journalists for their ongoing fight for justice, fairness, and dignity on their traditional lands and media coverage. Thank you, Professor Trish Audette Longo, for the warm introduction and for this invitation, and thank you to Professor Alan Thompson and the Carleton Journalism School for inviting me to speak here. We actually delayed on purpose because we know the Arab are coming and we're never on time.
Fashionably late.
Yes. I believe it may be a historic first for a Canadian journalism school to host a conversation on media coverage of Palestine. I am moved and honored. Thank you for exemplifying leadership on what I believe is one of the most urgent press freedom issues of our time. So I'm here today to talk about what's known as the Palestine exception. By a show of hands, how many people had heard about this before this talk? Okay, so most of you. For those of you hearing it for the first time, I'm going to give you just a small example before I get into the thick of the conversation. At CBC and other Canadian news organizations, language guides prohibit even use of the word Palestine. Even though 146 countries around the world, that's more than 75% of all of the world's countries, recognize the state of Palestine. Canada is not one of them. Meanwhile, CBC does use the word Taiwan in its coverage, even though Canada also does not recognize it as a sovereign state. But it's way bigger than just the use of the word. Here's how Carleton professor Nahla Abdu described it in an incredible, groundbreaking piece by then student journalist Rahaf Farawi in the Review of Journalism in 2022. Her piece was called CBC's Palestine Exception. There is a Palestine exception in Canada, and in Canadian media in particular. So you can talk about human rights violations anywhere in the world, but don't touch the Palestinians. They're not worthy of being aired, as you know, as colonized people. If you touch them, we don't listen to you. That's sort of the general unwritten rule. I have seen that general unwritten rule play out with me and others time and time again. What I'm going to do today is talk about my own experiences with the Palestine exception, illustrated through real-life examples. I'll be honest, in the past, I have been very skittish to talk about this. I'm very nervous as I speak to you here today, because I fear that I'm not enough of an expert on this complicated topic. But that is just one layer of fear. It's one I've learned to push through over the last few years. But I want to be clear, too, about where my expertise lies. To quote Ilyas Khouri, the towering Lebanese intellectual who passed away just earlier this month, he said, "I am a student of Shahrazad. I tell not the story, but how the story has been told." But before I start, I'd like to address the elephant in the room. In preparing for this lecture today, I consulted dozens of friends, peers, and colleagues, and also, yes, maybe a few lawyers. I said to them in my note that I sent out to a lot of group chats, I said, I feel like I have to be unimpeachable and not commit any faux pas or missteps. I said this to anyone who would listen. And this is part of the story of the Palestine exception. Part of the reason we do not talk about this is because of the fear. Me being here today, and all of you being here to listen, is part of a continued exercise for me in pushing past the fear and to stumble, however imperfectly, into this conversation. And I'm so glad that you're here with me to do it. If you had told me when I applied to journalism school that I'd be here speaking to you all today, I wouldn't have believed you. I did not grow up wanting to be a journalist. It was actually a pretty last-minute panic decision. I made it after finishing my undergraduate degree and facing down getting a real job or likely moving back home, neither of which I wanted to do. But journalism to me felt like license to be curious about the world for life. And I was a student of the world. I was born in Alexandria, Egypt, moved to Canada when I was 3. Oh. It seems that my slides are not, yeah. I'm gonna keep talking, but yeah, it would be great because to be able to have the slides go along with this. I was a student of the world. I was born in Alexandria, Egypt, and moved to Canada when I was 3. At 9 years old, we moved to Saudi Arabia, and I lived in 3 cities there over 5 years. I did high school in Dubai, and I'm so honored that some friends, and I would consider family from my years in Dubai, are here in the front row, VIP. Hella. And this quote that I'm going to read to you, that's up on my screen now, was something that really stayed with me. It was a quote that hung above my 10th grade English teacher's desk. Her name was Miss Valencia. She was from Malta. She had a wonderful, raspy, smoky voice. And this is a quote that I looked at every day in 10th grade, and it felt like a description of my life. It said, "I'm at home everywhere and nowhere. I'm never a stranger, and I never quite belong." Growing up, my dad ensured that my brother and I knew how to speak, read, and write Arabic, and enrolled us in French immersion schools in Toronto. So this mix of travel, languages, and forever being both an insider and outsider almost everywhere I went, coupled with my love of writing, made me apply to journalism school. I got in by the skin of my teeth. I was actually waitlisted. I begged them to let me in. And once I did get in, I'm delighted to report that I failed my very first journalism assignment. It taught me a very important lesson, a hard lesson. I had basically spelt the name of the person that I was interviewing wrong, and my professor at the time, Professor Bob Ortega, said to me, "If we can't trust you to get basic facts right, then we can't believe anything else that you report." So I learned a very hard lesson, but it's one that has never left me. Accuracy is everything in journalism, and I believe we've been failing the test of accuracy in covering Palestine for generations. I joined the CBC as an intern in 2009. For the first 2 years of my time at CBC, it was very on and off again work. I would check my email compulsively to see if the schedules needed me, and I never said no to a shift. 6 a.m., 2 p.m., 4 a.m., I said yes to everything. I was very precariously employed. Then came January 2011. Egypt was going through a revolution. Suddenly, my ability to speak Arabic and find compelling people to interview on the ground was highly sought out, catapulting me from barely employed casual producer to full-time unionized staff employee at the public broadcaster. I wept openly at work when Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak resigned in 2011. I remember the day very clearly. We had just recorded an interview with a protester in Tahrir Square for CBC Radio. I could barely hear our interviewer's voice over the cacophony of Cairo's traffic, the blaring horns, the whistling, the roar of applause. I kept my emotions in check until the interview ended, but tears flowed after I came out of the control room. A colleague then asked if he could record an interview with me about the moment's significance. Through tears, I said that watching this history unfold in Egypt, the country that my family and I left behind, made me think that perhaps I could go back and make it home again. That evening, the show aired a clip of my tearful burst of hope for my native Egypt. The CBC had proudly claimed me as one of their own. But as I found out, that kind of pride has its limits. In 2017, I produced an interview with a Palestinian American journalist, and I think this is where my story here begins. The journalist's name was Ahmed Shahabuddin. I caught wind of him being in Jerusalem to cover protests through a tweet that I found. And I'm wondering if we're able to pull up the presentation just yet. If not, I will continue reading. The Emmy-nominated journalist was covering protests at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Ah, wonderful. There's the quote. There's me and my mom in the back of a taxi in Alexandria. Wonderful, just in time. Thank you, tech team. I'm so glad this producer life is not mine anymore. Thank you. Not my problem. Thank you for fixing it for me. Thank you. So, this is the tweet. You're looking at the tweet that put Ahmed Shahabuddin on my radar. I was at the time working on, all right. It was working for a minute, right? You could see, no. Oh. Okay. Oh. So I'll keep telling the story. I'm a radio producer at heart, so we're just going to keep it moving. So what you're hopefully about to see is a tweet that I saw by Ahmed Shahabuddin. It's July 2017. I'm working on a weekly show, a magazine-style show. And I see this tweet by this journalist, Palestinian-American, Kuwaiti, Emmy-nominated journalist Ahmed Shahabuddin, at the time working for Al Jazeera. His tweet reads, "Got stopped, frisked, and pushed around by Israeli soldiers after reporting in Jerusalem today. My crime? Standing and looking Palestinian." Attached was a video, about 1 minute and 40 seconds, of him getting pretty aggressively questioned by some officers. I thought, this is an interesting story. I want to talk to him not just about covering the protests, but about what it's like to cover it as a Palestinian. We did record the interview. He initially did not get back to my interview request. I pitched it on a Monday. For those of you in the news world, pitched it on Monday, and every single day was told, where's the story, where's the story, where's the story? We want this to be our lead story. Yay! Oh, all right. So I was told explicitly by the team that this was basically, they wanted it to be their lead story. They really wanted this story. They were on my case about it. At the 11th hour, basically on a Thursday on a weekly show, Ahmed writes back and says, let's do it. We recorded it on a Friday. And I was surprised that we were doing it. Ahmed Shahabuddin, he talked about some very important things that I think are very relevant today. He talked about the harassment and intimidation he experienced at the hands of Israeli officers while reporting, linking it to a pattern of intimidation documented by organizations like the Foreign Press Association. Out of the thousands of interviews that I had produced over my 10 years at the public broadcaster, this is the only one that didn't make it to air. Not only did it not make it to air, it was pulled with no explanation to me, no conversation about what went wrong, no editorial discussion whatsoever. I am cautiously going to say that I would like to play a clip from that interview. Maybe if I speak gently, it'll stay. But I'll be honest, I have never, ever shared this audio before. In fact, I was so marked by this experience that I thought somehow I had done something really wrong. But days ago, I'm talking days ago, I admit I have been working on this presentation for a very long time, including up until 5 a.m. this morning, because there's so much that I want to say. And it's only days ago that I listened to this interview for the very first time. I was afraid of what I would hear. But I'm going to play it for you. I'm going to play about 5 minutes, a little bit of a listen, so sit back, really listen. Radio is a very intimate medium. So just listen to what Ahmed's saying. What you're about to hear is the answer that he gave to a question that we had put to him. This is how I'd written it in the script. The Foreign Press Association put out a statement condemning the restrictions on journalists trying to cover the events around the holy sites in Jerusalem. He was at Al-Aqsa Mosque. What kind of challenges did you face? So again, he gives a full answer here, and I want you to listen carefully to what he says. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I just asked God for help for the text to, yes, just translation.
Worries me to be as candid as I will be. I feel like it's my duty and responsibility. Israel has long prevented journalists from practicing journalism and documenting the reality on the ground. There is, so much evidence that can confirm this reality. But having covered Israel in the past and the occupied West Bank and traveling throughout Israel in the past, this time, what was extremely impossible to ignore as a reporter on the ground, what I could not ignore was the way in which I was targeted. In the past, it's long been known for any journalist who's reported inside Israel and the occupied West Bank that you are targeted. The Israeli government does not want the reality on the ground to get out. I am not saying this as reflecting my personal views. I am saying this as a journalist. I received a lot of criticism as a Palestinian originally myself. My parents fled in 48 and 67, and as a Muslim for entering the Al-Aqsa Mosque because they viewed it as, controversial given the restrictions. That said, my job in going there was to report what was happening on the ground. And when I say you're targeted, I mean when you say you're a journalist, they hit you, they push you, they break your camera. These are not tales that exist in a vacuum. There is a pattern of suppression when it comes to how the Israeli army in particular treats journalists. I was at one of, go ahead. I was just going to say one,
Yes, go ahead.
just one quick anecdote. Forgive me for being long-winded.
No,
but,
please go ahead.
I was at Bab al-Aswat, which is one of the entrances to the compound. It was my first night there. And there's a little pen on the left side. It's very narrow streets. And I was standing there with, people from BBC, from CNN, from all kinds of news organizations, big and small, local and foreign. What the Israeli soldiers do is the minute the call to prayer ends, within less than 5 minutes, without any provocation, I witnessed this day after day. And any journalist who is on the ground will repeat the same thing if they're telling the truth. Within 5 minutes, because the Israeli army the Israeli army and the settlers and the tension is so palpable on both sides, they immediately want to disperse the crowds. So what they do is they either use water cannons or sound bombs, and they use tactics that are violations of international law. There is ample amounts of video online that documents in the past week and in years prior that Israeli soldiers shoot tear gas canisters, sound bombs directly into narrow hallways, into mosques, into religious institutions like mosques, into schools, into refugee camps. These are all violations of international law. And beyond the excessive force, I was standing in the corner and I identified myself and was wearing press gear. And, I told the soldiers I was pressed. They saw that I had a camera, I had a cameraman, I had a crew. The minute they started attacking the crowds to disperse them, they throw sound bombs directly in the direction of the media. And that is a tactic that they use to immediately limit the amount of cameras that will then document the following and ongoing onslaught. Now,
What does that feel like? What does that feel like, a sound bomb?
It feels like a very loud explosion. And it's so scary because you don't know whether it is in fact a sound bomb, or if it is a weapon, or if it is a tear gas canister. And these weapons, sound bombs, have killed Palestinians. These are lethal weapons, even if not intended to be lethal. If used in the way the Israeli soldiers use them, they can very much be lethal. And what it sounds like is a loud snap in your ear. You hear a ringing, there's smoke. It smells a little bit like tear gas, even though it's not C2 gas. And what I'm trying to say is the minute they threw that, what happens is you essentially realize in that moment that they are using it to then disperse the crowd, make everyone run away, which I didn't run away. Because I didn't run away, in the seconds that followed, one of the Israeli soldiers, making eye contact with me, as I turned my back to cover my face, he took his gun and he smashed it into my back repeatedly. Now, this is a soldier of a government that claims to be a democracy. He knew I was pressed. He knew I was vulnerable. And he made a decision to strike me and beat me. Now, I am not the victim. I was there doing my job. But that, to answer your earlier question, what does that feel like? That makes me all the more motivated to document the abuses of power that are happening. Not to reach a political aim or necessarily to influence any sort of political resolution, but to simply counter the narrative that the Israeli government is putting out there, which is, again, that they are a democracy. That has no place in any democracy.
So as is standard, I had also put in a request with the IDF, knowing that we were doing this interview. We also asked Ahmed a few pushback questions, including a claim by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that Al Jazeera was inciting violence, to which Ahmed responded, we're carrying cameras, they're carrying guns, who's inciting violence, just to be brief. But I put in my request to the IDF. I edited this interview down. It was 26 minutes, brought it down to about 7, went for a celebratory coffee, as is ritual when you cut down a long interview. I got back to my desk, and it was right then that I was told the interview would not be airing. I was not given a reason and was told instead to take it up with management. I was in shock. This is the first time that I was shut out of my own story, and I felt shame. I felt like I'd done something wrong, except no one would actually tell me what it was. Our own editorial processes, our transparency, were all thrown out the window. This was not the first or last time I'd had a disagreement editorially, although this was not a disagreement as much as it was outright censorship. As a journalist, editorial disagreements happen all the time, and in fact, I think they're signs of a healthy newsroom. We should be able to disagree, push back, question each other's choices. In 2020, I wrote about some of these other disagreements and the hollowness of Canadian media's diversity in my feature essay for The Walrus, Objectivity is a Privilege Afforded to White Journalists. Writing that helped pave the way for me to speak about this here today, and I'm eternally and forever indebted to The Walrus's independent, rigorous, fact-checked journalism. The basic premise of the piece, which was based on my 10 years at the public broadcaster, was that news organizations love to talk about diversity, but do not live up to its ideals. I said the concept of objectivity is often weaponized against racialized journalists and racialized people, specifically Black and Indigenous people. I used real-life examples from my own reporting, like I'm doing here today, where under the guise of balance or verification, Black and Indigenous people's stories were sometimes shut down, challenged, and doubted. In the other two instances I wrote about in my Walrus piece, I detailed editorial disagreements I went through while covering protests against police brutality in Baltimore and while covering anti-Indigenous racism in Canadian healthcare. There's a crucial difference, though, between these other examples. In both of the other cases, although we disagreed, debated, those stories ultimately went to air. The Palestine one did not. This was the Palestine exception embodied for me. Here's what I want to emphasize. For the non-journalists in the room, it is not standard practice to kill a story with no due process or without it meeting a very high bar. It has to be deeply factually incorrect or perhaps full of significant legal concerns that may lead to litigation. That's the bar. 2 years after my unaired interview with the Palestinian journalist, I left my full-time, permanent, unionized job at the public broadcaster. I could have stayed there till I was 60. But I sensed that I'd hit a ceiling that I could not crack, and I was not wrong. After I left, I learned that this unaired interview, that I still had no idea what the problem was, had marked me as biased by a senior manager who then opposed my attempts at advancing into a position of editorial leadership. It was devastating, but it was also affirming. I hadn't imagined it then. Because, when these things happen, you think, is it just me? Did that really happen? And this really affirmed to me something that I felt. I really had been sidelined by the very same institution that once held me up as an example of the feel-good, low-stakes diversity Canadian media loves. There's this perception that those who cover Israel and its government's policies and actions are obsessed with singling it out. but in my decade at the public broadcaster, I produced stories on alleged violations in almost every country in the region: Tunisia, Libya, Syria, my native Egypt, Sudan, Saudi Arabia. I helped colleagues all over the building with their coverage too, as one of very few Arabic speakers in the building. I consistently received requests to translate videos of armed groups, of Syrian fighters, of ISIS, of Daesh. I covered the repression of Uyghurs in China, the Rohingya in Myanmar, Yazidis in Iraq. I covered Canada's mistreatment of Indigenous peoples. I covered police violence against Black people in the US and Canada. My journalism has always been fueled by a value we like to say we hold dear: seek out the marginalized, excluded, and oppressed, tell their stories with nuance and complexity, while holding the powerful to account. Working alongside some of our industry's best, we received awards for our sensitive, hard-hitting journalism. It felt like no topic was off the table until my journalism focused on the actions of the Israeli government and military, especially as recounted by a Palestinian. I want to pause here to talk about objectivity. What does objectivity have to do with this? I believe one of the reasons that we're here today is because journalism has really lost its way on this issue. While many organizations see objectivity as a required personal quality of journalist, this is never what it was meant to be. Instead, according to Tom Rosenstiel, who literally wrote the journalism textbook that I, and I'm sure many of you have used, objectivity is a discipline of verification, as Trish nodded to in her intro. We have to be objective about the methods that we do journalism precisely because we have biases. Here's part of a lengthy, wonderful, great thread by Tom Rosenstiel that he wrote in the summer of 2020 when the question of objectivity was taking over yet again after George Floyd's murder cracked that open again. He said, when the concept of objectivity migrated to journalism in the 20s, it was not intended to suggest journalists were without bias. It was actually just the opposite. The idea was that journalists needed to employ objective, observable, repeatable methods of verification precisely because they could never be personally objective. Passionate, independent inquiry does not mean mindlessly giving both sides equal treatment, thinking there are just two sides to a story, or using balance as an excuse for not doing the work of finding the truth. I actually got to meet Tom Rosenstiel right here at Carleton 2 years ago, where we both were speaking at the Truth in Journalism conference. And in true journalism nerd fashion, I brought my Elements of Journalism textbook with me and I got him to sign it. We took a picture together. I wish I could show it to you. We look cute. We're smiling, we're beaming, we're having wonderful conversations about objectivity. And he inscribed something in the page of my book that I hold very dear. He wrote, "For Pacinthe, a fellow missionary in the journey towards telling true stories." Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones, creator of the 1619 Project, rejects the premise of journalism, rejects the premise of objectivity in journalism outright. Here is part of what she told Poynter in an interview earlier this month. "I have been very explicit and outspoken on this," she said, "in that I don't feel journalism is, by definition, an objective profession or a neutral profession. The reason I founded the Center for Journalism and Democracy at Howard is to say, we have to take a stance on certain things. I often quote the motto of the Washington Post, which is, 'Democracy dies in darkness.' That's not a neutral stance," Nikole Hannah-Jones says. "That's saying that our role as journalists is to protect democracy, right? So I actually see all good journalism as activism." Nikole goes on to say, "I think far too often we are now taught that objectivity requires us to adhere to this notion of balance, even when we are reporting on a political system that has a tremendous imbalance. I say our obligation is not to balance our objectivity. Our obligation is to the truth." My Walrus essay earned some awards, and crucially, it paved my way into the Neiman Fellowship at Harvard University as the Martin Wise Goodman Canadian Neiman Fellow. There, every fellow has to give what's known as a sounding. It's a presentation, kind of like what I'm doing now, except it's much smaller. It's just with the fellows. It's very intimate, quite soul-bearing stuff, where we ask the question, why do you do what you do? People go really deep on this question. And I shared things in that room that I actually wish I could share with you here tonight, and I actually put it in the talk and took it out because it was a little too intimate, but I hope to talk about it further one day. But getting to share my story about this Palestine interview and the mark that it made on me in uncensored, painstaking detail with a room full of the best journalists. There's my National Magazine Award. So glad you could find that. All right. So at this, okay, maybe it's a clicker issue. It's on a different computer now. It's on a different computer. Wonderful. Wow. Yes, thank you, tech team, and thank you all for your patience. So this is my Neiman Foundation class. These are the fellows that I got to share my story with in more detail that I'm sharing with you here today. I considered sharing it with you, but I'm not there quite yet. But sharing the story of this Palestine interview that did not go to air was one of the most validating and healing experiences in my journalism career. I expected to be judged, to have my journalism on this story questioned, scrutinized yet again, but the opposite happened. Many of these fellow journalists I spoke to in the room that day have now become some of my closest, most intimate friends. I couldn't have dreamed that the thing that lost me my future at the CBC helped me gain the best friends in the world, who also happen to be some of the best journalists. They taught me that journalistic excellence does not preclude empathy, kindness, and justice. They are from Venezuela, from China, from Hong Kong, and Colombia, and the US. They've seen the oppression of dictators and police forces quashing protests for Black lives. Some have even been jailed or charged for their reporting. I am in awe of their courage. We understood each other's experiences intimately and have stood by each other. And it's through their courage that I'm finding mine. Talking about my unaired Palestine interview with them and its impact on me in the room at Harvard that day helped me put the shame away, and it's part of the reason why I'm even able to speak to you all about it today. Instead of shame, I was emboldened by the power of what solid, fact-checked journalism gave me the courage to speak about. The doors it opened to me. I vowed to continue the uphill work of improving our industry by critiquing it, like I am now. By the way, the application window for Canadians to apply for the Martin Wise Goodman Neiman Fellowship opens tomorrow. Mid-career journalists, I really urge you to apply, especially if you are feeling burnt out and drained by the industry. The application window closes on December 1st. You're going to need some references. I'm giving you the warning. It opens at midnight tonight. I did one last interview about the Palestine exception in Canadian media. Yay, it worked. During my Neiman year at Harvard, and it was for the piece published by the Review of Journalism called CBC's Palestine Exception that I quoted earlier. I had somehow become, due to writing about it once in the Walrus, using my name on the record, one of very few people who touched this. When the piece was published, this piece in the review, it began with this editor's note that you're looking at, which read in part, "The Review of Journalism spoke with numerous former and current CBC journalists for this story. All asked for anonymity out of fear of impact on their current employment and/or professional reputation. And I will be honest, as I stand here before you today, I worry about what the implications of me speaking about this in such detail so publicly will be." I, on the other hand, felt very comfortable talking to the Review, talking about my experiences, because once again, I had this solid, bulletproof, fact-checked piece for the Walrus. I remember at the time thinking, you know, I think I'm done talking about this. I think I've done my part here. Or so I thought. Then October 7th hit. I knew something was wrong because my Instagram suddenly blew up with Palestinian flags everywhere. And there was one lone Israeli flag as well. Just seeing that stream of flags across my Instagram, I just had this visceral sinking feeling that something really bad had happened because all of my friends all over the world were posting about it. I knew it had to be big. But I said to myself, I'm not touching this. I've done this before. You know what? I'm not even working in news. I'm an independent journalist now. I'm doing other work. But then a friend wrote to me on Instagram. She said, "I often come to your account to see what news you might share on religion and equity and politics. I always appreciate your informed perspective. Where can I go to understand, using facts and maybe a little empathy, what's happening in Israel right now? I didn't have much to say. I directed her to a video I had just posted of MSNBC journalist Ayman Mohyeddin, who was featured in the incredible documentary The War Around Us, for anyone who's seen it. It was during Israel's war on Gaza in 2008 and 2009, and he was one of 2 foreign correspondents there. This is someone with intimate knowledge who's actually lived in Gaza, and one of the most visible Arab American journalists in North America. And I saw him struggle to make a point. This is days after October 7th, if you remember what that time was like. I saw him make a point on MSNBC that has not left me since that day. He said, "Many Americans are going to ask, why is this happening? Why is there no peace? But the very nature of how we have been looking at this conflict, the narrative by which we have been trying to understand what is happening has not been accurate. So we are not able to accurately solve the problem." Narrative. That word, narrative. Narrative is everything. Who do we hear from? When do we hear from them? How often? What language do we use? Who gets coverage that fuels empathy? Who gets coverage that fuels stereotypes and hate? And most crucially, does the average person understand why this is happening? Does a Canadian understand the role their government might be playing in supporting a status quo that fuels never-ending cycles of violence in Israel and Palestine? There has been incredible reporting on these questions by my fellow colleagues in Canadian media over the last year, featuring not just anecdotes like mine, but analysis and data on how the media here covers this. There's the imbalanced way that Canadian media reports on Israel and Palestine. Analysis by reporter Emma Paling for The Breach captured the underrepresentation of Palestinian voices and the hierarchy of language used to describe the killing of Israelis, which is vicious, murderous, brutal, versus the killing of Palestinians, remote. I especially want to highlight a piece published in The Breach, written by a former CBC journalist. Headline: CBC has whitewashed Israel's crimes in Gaza. I saw it firsthand. The subheadline read, "Working for 5 years as a producer at the public broadcaster, I witnessed the double standards and discrimination in its coverage of Palestine and experienced directly how CBC disciplines those who speak out." It's worth noting that this piece was published under a pseudonym, given the risks of talking about this issue. It is also worth noting that this journalist is Jewish. Her testimony helped make the case that the Palestine exception is not limited to Arab journalists, although we are perhaps most at risk of experiencing it, but rather it applies to anyone who tries to cover it, or most people, to be precise. But it's especially Palestinian journalists who bear the brunt of this. I reached out to the CBC for comment on my and others' claims about the Palestine exception there. Here's part of what the spokesperson wrote back to me. "We categorically reject the suggestion there's a Palestine exception alive." They actually wrote the Palestinian exception alive at CBC, or that certain coverage is off limits, end quote. Meanwhile, over the last year, at least 2 Palestinian journalists in Canada said they were fired from their outlets after expressing solidarity for their own people, while critiquing the root causes of their displacement. Even before October 7th, Palestinian journalists were writing about obscuring their identities from journalism colleagues entirely. I myself was at a little bit of a loss for words given all of this after October 7th, shocked by the horror of what was unfolding and not sure what to do now as an independent journalist, with no newsroom to work in or produce for. I tried to capture the brewing frustration and fear I had in this tweet. I said, "It's at times like these where there is an absolute bloodlust for more punishment, more cruelty, where the need for responsible, accurate, humanizing, unflinching journalism has the most crucial role. A big part of why we're here today is because we have failed at this for decades. Journalism that's courageous, consistent, and contextualized, the clarifying and exponential power of all those things together, not just one or two, would have long ago shown and explained how the status quo in Israel and Palestine eviscerates conditions for peace, not obfuscated it." What I meant to say there is that, yes, Palestinians do occasionally make it in the media here. They are often brought on to share trauma, but prevented from sharing crucial context, that is, the Nakba, Israel's illegal occupation, invasion, annexation, and siege of their lands. They are often brought on only when Israelis have been killed or injured. To draw from an essay by Palestinian writer Mohammed Kurd, who wrote, in 1984, in response to the Israeli-Lebanese war, Edward Said published his essay, Permission to Narrate, where he critiqued the Western media's biased coverage of the war, which favored the Israeli narrative and suppressed the Palestinian viewpoint. Today, we are in a very similar predicament. Israeli politicians and analysts go on TV to frame the so-called conflict, while only Palestinian victims get that opportunity. And even then, they aren't interviewed as much as interrogated. So, in the days after October 7th, I decided to turn my Instagram into a little mini newsroom. At first, I was alternating, one after the other, alternating between posts and stories from inside Israel and from Gaza. I watched multiple interviews featuring Israeli survivors of Hamas's attack, especially from those who'd lost family members. I shed tears along with Moaz Inan, an Israeli who lost both of his parents during Hamas's attack. I watched him plead tearfully in a BBC interview to not have his parents justify the killing of more people. I listened to Noy Katzman, whose brother Chaim, a peace activist, was also killed during Hamas's attack. Noy also told Jake Tapper at CNN that he did not want his brother's death to fuel more violence. I learned about Vivian Silver, a Jewish-Canadian humanitarian from Winnipeg who was killed in Hamas's attack. I learned about her through a tribute, a beautiful tribute, written by a Palestinian peace activist who worked with her, which read in part, I know you will be greeted up above by your Palestinian and Israeli partners in activism, and the thousands of other victims of this pointless war. Soon I began to pay attention to another story unfolding, the beginning of Israel's assault on Gaza and its over 2 million inhabitants, half of them children. One report stuck out to me and really stopped me in my tracks. It was by Youssef Hamesh, a journalist in Gaza who was reporting for Channel 4 News. Its visceral simplicity transported me. I want to play it for you, and as you watch, I want you to remember that this is what Palestinians' reality has been since October 7th, and in fact, many have lived through this multiple times in their lifetime already. I might move forward in the interest of time if the sound does not work, but the visuals alone, as you're looking, this is a car that's being used as a makeshift ambulance. People are looking for their children in the street. This woman is looking for her baby, and as this man hands her her child, who she's been looking for, she's so overcome with emotion. Watch this right here. She collapses. I want you to imagine the sheer chaos of this being life for the last 11 months. I wish you could hear the VO because the writing is so simple. And there's something about this report that, despite the thousands of things I've watched since October 7th, this one really struck me. Then I started seeing how reporters were finding their own family and friends in the hospitals that they were going in to report on. This is the BBC's Adnan al-Bursh. And this report made me cry when I first watched it. I'm just gonna, it's a short, it's a minute. The sound is not working, but you can read the caption there. He is walking through the corridors of a hospital in Gaza, in the Shifa hospital. And everywhere he's looking, people are screaming for help. And then he finds, and his cameraman, they find people they know. Imagine you're reporting on a story for the journalists in the room, and you walk into a hospital and you see your friends and family, but you're on the job. These are my neighbors. This is my community, he said. Today has been one of the most difficult days in my career. I have seen things I can never unsee. This is the story that I really started to pay attention to, that journalists in Gaza were part of the story. And then the story was about how we, international journalists, could not talk about the journalists in Gaza who were reporting on this story. Then I got my first interview request. This whole time I'm just posting my little Instagram stories. A fellow journalist had gotten a request to do an interview with Al Jazeera about media coverage in Palestine. They were not comfortable doing it, they told me. Would I do it instead? You already wrote about it in The Walrus. I've heard this so many times. I'll admit I hesitated. This, once again, was the story that ended my career, quote unquote, in mainstream media. The sting was still there. I didn't want to touch it. But I thought, you know, let me just do a call with the producer and see what they have to say. So I'm walking through my neighborhood on the Danforth, walking by a dog park, and the producer says to me, we might have to cancel it if, and then suddenly I couldn't hear anymore because of the dogs. And I said, wait, you might have to cancel it if what? And she said, if there's a ground invasion in Gaza, we might have to cancel it. So here I was, afraid once again of speaking about this, when in Gaza, people were facing the reality of a potential ground invasion. Hearing that made my fear wilt. And it's always in reference to the fear that Palestinians face that I try to find the courage, because what fear could I possibly have in relation to that? So I accepted and I joined The Take, Al Jazeera's daily podcast, detailing my experiences with the CBC and the lopsided way many media organizations, not just the CBC, cover Israel and Palestine. Then I got another message from another journalist. They had been invited to speak about Palestine in media coverage on a podcast here called Canada Land. After some hesitation and what I thought was a productive and encouraging pre-interview with the producer and host, I agreed. In October, I went on Canada Land and I spoke about many of the things that I'm speaking to you here about today. I spoke about the risks that journalists in Gaza are facing, how no foreign correspondents were being allowed in, how we had a duty to listen to those who are bearing witness for us. I talked about the killing of Lebanese Reuters photojournalist Assam Abdallah, killed by shelling, quote, from the direction of Israel, end quote. I talked about the importance of verification and the urgent need for journalists not to be, once again, mere stenographers, but to verify extremely, extremely dangerous, reckless, and unfounded claims of beheaded babies, which many, many journalistic outlets ran with no verification, and I think that paved the way for the violence that we're seeing today. I also made the point that even in the early foggy days, quote unquote, of Israel's assault on Gaza, there were patterns and information that we were receiving from journalists on the ground about what Israel's intentions were. I raised a real-life case study I just watched. An Arab journalist with Al Arabi TV, his name is Ahmed Darawsha, was doing a live stand-up reporting on the new Israeli incursion. Here's a video of that incident that ran on the UK's independent paper online. They took the video from Al Arabi and posted it on the Independent. I want you to watch what happens. Oh, it might not work. Okay, fine. So the clip might not work, but basically this was an Arab journalist, Ahmed Darawsha. He's doing a stand-up reporting, and then all of a sudden he is interrupted. A man comes up to him and yells at him and says, "What are you doing? What are you talking about? You better be saying good things about what the Israeli military is doing." He was wearing a hat that said security. He was yelling at him in Hebrew and said, "You better be saying good things or else." And Ahmed Darawsha says, "Hi, I'm doing a live stand-up." And he says, "I don't care about your stand-up. What are you saying?" Then he leaves, and Ahmed Darawsha calmly goes back to his stand-up and reports. He says, "We're being threatened by an Israeli officer. He's armed." And just as he's about to say what's happening, the officer shows up again. This time he turns directly to camera, and he says, "We're going to flatten Gaza to dust." To dust. He said it twice. So I brought this example up in my Canada Land interview about what the Israeli military was intending to do, by their own words. When I listened to my interview the morning it aired, that anecdote was there, but later in the day I saw this bizarre note on my episode. It said, as you see, correction. A previous version of this episode featured claims of an altercation between an alleged Israeli officer and Arabic reporter. elements of which Canada Land has not been able to verify. This was confusing to me. I wrote for clarification to the producer, who I'd had a wonderful experience with, by the way. I shared links to The Independent. This was written up in Newsweek. It had made the rounds in Western media. I hate that I'm even saying that. The Western media confirmed that it happened, therefore it's legit. I saw with my own eyes and ears this man on Al Arabi TV, a veteran war reporter who has been reporting for 11 months, get threatened and intimidated. And it was excised from an interview in Canadian media. So I asked, what happened here? I wrote to the producer, but instead I heard from the editor-in-chief at Canada Land. And here's part of what that editor-in-chief, this is what she wrote to me. Because so much of what is being reported, she said, and even the best media is being retracted as new facts surface, we had concerns about being able to confirm some of what was reported, not by you, but by the outlets. For example, one issue being debated was if the officer was a police officer or security. Rather than let it sit out there when we were unsure, it seemed more responsible to pull it. She suggested we speak on the phone, but of course, as a journalist, you want these conversations on the record in writing. I wrote back to ask what specifically you had concerns about. I wrote back and said, what is it that you're trying to verify here? I also said that my bigger concern is that whether the Israeli was a police officer or a security officer seemed to be a very minute distinction given the larger point that I was making, that the Israelis have expressed a clear intent to flatten Gaza. This was in October. And that this threat was made live on the air to a reporter who was intimidated and harassed in the course of his duties reporting. I thought this would matter to a show about media criticism. I said I was deeply disappointed by the correction, and I urged her to reconsider it. Though we did have one brief, and I mean very brief, conversation about this, me and the editor-in-chief, at a journalism event soon afterwards, I still had no idea why this correction was made. I followed up again over 2 weeks later. I know sometimes these things take time, there's editorial processes, no problem. My follow-up once again yielded no response. About 2 weeks after my third and final attempt to the editor-in-chief to find out what had happened here, Reporters Without Borders put out this statement. Reporters Without Borders, Reporters Sans Frontières, calls for an immediate end to harassment, intimidation of journalists in Israel. What you're looking at is actually a thumbnail of the very incident that I'm talking to you about. The one that Canada Land said it could not verify. Now it is the headline image on a report by Reporters Without Borders. What is it that they can verify that you cannot? It is now literally a visual description of what journalists are facing. While I waited for an explanation on this so-called correction, I wanted to say Canada Land updated the correction to say this incident had been verified elsewhere, but still did not update their correction. While I waited for this explanation, Canada Land put out yet another additional clarification on my interview. And this is where, earlier I talked about being not perfect on this, I'm not an expert. In my interview with them, I referred to 75 years of occupation. What I was referring to was the Nakba in 1948, that in 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly expelled from the land. The point that I was trying to make was that this context is always missing from coverage, and we're not able to talk about it. But I made a mistake. I'm admitting it to you now. The occupation began officially in 1967. So it was wrong to say, according to international standards, that it began in 1975. In 1948. So they added yet another note to my interview. So here's how my episode looks right now on Canada Land to this day. You look at it and you think, this must be a bunch of just misinformation. It just looks like there's something really wrong here. I just listened to my interview again to see how the bulk of what I was saying holds up, and I have to say I'm very proud of how I did in that interview. This correction and clarification was actually just published in Canada Land's annual transparency report, and I find it ironic that I was exempt from that very transparency. Here, once again, was the Palestine exception, even in an interview about coverage of Palestine. I was proud of my interview, and I heard from many people after the interview who agreed. One of them was my former professor, journalism professor. Here's the email he wrote to me. I heard you talking good sense from the heart. So very hard to pull that off on Canada Land the other day, and continue to admire your ability to speak up against prevailing wisdoms to reflect experience that otherwise remains under a blanket, something I first appreciated many years ago in the classroom. You are walking an emotionally demanding and perhaps lonely road, he wrote. As the go-to person for risky commentary about journalism, more than once in the interview, I heard the reluctance and strain and risk awareness in your voice. Maybe you're hearing a bit of it today. Yeah, it's part of it. I also heard from a Canada Land subscriber, now former. Here's part of what they wrote. I just wanted to reach out and thank you personally for your courage in being a guest speaker to Canada Land Shortcuts episode on Thursday, October 19th. I used to be a Patreon supporter of Canada Land, and that was the last episode that I listened to of their content. I canceled my subscription right after, realizing how angry and sad I was towards Canada Land with their reporting. Their whole mandate was about being critical of the news, and I wrote a comment calling them out for their horrendous coverage on the war between Israel and Gaza, commending you for your bravery. I just wanted to reach out today and say thank you. Your bravery and courage in that episode did not go unnoticed and warmed my heart. Ironically, one of the things that we discussed in this Canada Land interview, which I think was a really good interview, not because of my own participation, but because of what we got to talk about. At its best, we got to talk about things that we really do not get to talk about in Canadian media, and that's what they have done very well in the past. One of the things that we talked about was this campaign of delegitimization, intimidation, and harassment waged by a group called Honest Reporting Canada against journalists whose coverage of Israel and Palestine criticizes the actions of the Israeli state or appears in any way sympathetic to Palestinians. What you're looking at, this is part of a story published by Davide Mastracci in The Maple, one of many independent media outlets that's been doing great work, and here's part of what his story on the group said. In July 2023, Honest Reporting Canada Executive Director Mike Fagelman proclaimed that the group wants to, quote, create a digital army for Israel, end quote. In an October 13, 2023 fundraising email, Fagelman acknowledged mass criticism of Israel and wrote, quote, to prevail, it's imperative that we operate by the maxim that the best defense is a strong offense and to work to control the narrative. Once again, the word narrative. To that end, we've established a war room in order to, as he mentions later in the email, allow HRC to act as Israel's short sword and shield. Eventually, days after my Canada Land interview aired, just as we discussed in my interview, Honest Reporting Canada did come after me, as they do to many journalists, often women, often racialized, often younger, often precarious. They sent out an action alert to their members with my face and name plastered across it, saying that I said, Israel has no right to exist. I said no such thing. But they used the 75 years of occupation slip-up to say that I said that Israel had no right to exist. The article, quote-unquote article, about my interview was rife with inaccuracies. But they did use one of my favorite pictures of me, so thank you, Honest Reporting Canada, for the glamour shot. To Canada Land's credit, they did a follow-up about this targeting and talked about this very pattern of who they target. And it was one of the first times I've seen media institutions actually talk and name and address the actions of Honest Reporting Canada instead of bowing to them. And they talked about their efforts to delegitimize journalists who offer any critiques of Israel. In the US, a very similarly named organization called Honest Reporting suggested that journalists in Gaza, this is much more dangerous than a group in Canada, this group in the US, Honest Reporting, said that journalists in Gaza had knowledge and or had participated in the attacks, in the Hamas attacks, essentially putting a target on their backs. It was heartening and groundbreaking, I think, to see that AFP and New York Times both sent out statements standing by their journalists, pushing back against these baseless accusations. Honest Reporting, in fact, apologized. Look what happens when news outlets stand by their journalists. There's something very powerful about seeing news organizations support their reporters instead of further penalizing them. Meanwhile, in Gaza, a pattern is beginning to emerge. Journalists in Gaza were being killed, not just reporting it, it's not in an active war zone. Some of these journalists are killed while sleeping at home with their families. Journalists on the ground often said it was Israeli airstrikes that targeted them. Here's the moment Palestine TV correspondent Salman al-Bashir reported on the killing of his colleague Muhannad Abu Hatab in November, who had just been on the air before him half an hour ago.
نستطيع أن نحتمل لقد أنهكنا إننا هنا ضحايا شهداء مع فرق التوقيت فقط نحن نمضي واحدا تلو الآخر ولا أحد ينظر إلينا ولا إلى حجم الكارثة والجريمة التي نعيشها في غزة. لا حماية دولية، لا حماية دولية على الإطلاق، ولا حصانة لأي شيء. لا تحمينا هذه الدروع ولا تحمينا هذه القبعات، إنها مجرد شعارات نرتديها فقط، هي لا تحمي أي صحفي على الإطلاق. على الإطلاق لا تحمينا هذه الدروع ولا هذه ما نرتديها فقط، هي شعارات فقط. نحن هنا ضحايا على الهواء مباشرة، نفقد الأرواح واحدا تلو الآخر بلا أي ثمن، نمضي شهداء فقط مع فرق التوقيت. نحن ننتظر الدور واحدا تلو الآخر. زميلنا محمد أبو حطب كان هنا منذ نصف ساعة فقط وغادرنا الآن، هو وزوجته وابنه وأخيه وكثير من عائلته هم ضحايا هنا في داخل المستشفى.
I'm genuinely curious, did anyone hear about this in Canadian media? Yeah. There's a real resounding silence on this by most international press freedom organizations, including here in Canada, and everywhere. At this point, the number of killed journalists was around 35 that had been believed to have been killed by Israeli airstrikes or shelling. I didn't see the outrage, solidarity, or concern that Western journalists often get when they're kidnapped or killed. As a rule, we know journalists do not sign open letters or petitions or take a stand. But when I saw a letter circulating condemning the killing of journalists in Gaza, I signed it with little to no hesitation. That weekend, I was invited to join Al Jazeera's Inside Story to talk about why I did. My co-panelist in the middle there is Ahmed Al-Naouq. He runs an organization called We Are Not Numbers. Palestinians are often spoken about in numbers. You've probably heard the number, 40,000? Maybe we're at 50,000. The number is likely much higher. Muhannad Abu Hatab was killed with 11 members of his family. Numbers. So Ahmed Al-Naouq was talking about who had lost, and I forget the exact number, he had lost over 20 members of his family in an airstrike, and he talked about the experience of being invited to be on the media in an interview, only to be questioned, how do you have so many family members? How do you know that it was? So he talked about the indignity of being trotted out on the media just to defend and justify and explain his pain. In this interview, I said I was alarmed by the silence of fellow journalists on the apparent targeting of our colleagues in Gaza, and said that despite the rule that journalists should not take any stances, if we cannot say we are against the killing of journalists, we're talking about ourselves here, our colleagues. What are we even doing as a profession? How can we remain objective and neutral about the fact that journalists were being killed while doing their jobs, or even sleeping at home with their families? One image that will stay with me for a very long time is Al Jazeera Gaza bureau chief Wael al-Dahduh shell-shocked face when he learned that his wife, Amna, his grandchild, Adam, his 15-year-old son, Mahmoud, and 7-year-old daughter, Shem, were killed in an Israeli airstrike in the Nusayrat refugee camp in October. He himself was live on the air reporting on the very strike that killed his family. Images of him rushing to the hospital to find and clutch their bodies, surrounded by crowds of people, stunned me into silence. Somehow, Wael al-Dahduh was on the air reporting after this devastating loss, I think the next day. Then, in January, his eldest son, Hamza, a fellow journalist, was killed in an Israeli airstrike on the car he was traveling in with fellow journalist Mustafa Thuraya. There are just a few of many, many Palestinian journalists who were buried along with their blue press vests and helmets. It is not an accident, I think, that I'm here talking to you at Carleton, home of the Shireen Abu Akleh Emerging Reporter Award in Social Justice Journalism, established just last year by Professor Alan Thompson. Shireen Abu Akleh was killed wearing her blue press vest and helmet while covering a raid on the Jenin refugee camp on May 11, 2022. She died by a sniper shot to the head, just outside of the range of where her helmet covers. The Israeli army often boasts about its precision. Initially, Israel denied that they were responsible, but subsequent investigations and testimony from eyewitnesses said that she was deliberately targeted. Even after Israel's acceptance of responsibility for her death, no one has been held accountable. Even in death, attacks continued. Mourners carrying Shireen Abu Akleh's casket during her funeral were attacked and beaten. Her gravesite has been desecrated by the Israeli army, according to a report by the International Federation of Journalists. As I was watching this happening and posting about it nearly nonstop on my Instagram, it also turned into a little bit of a confessional booth of sorts. Journalists from all over the country and even outside of Canada, seeing that I was posting about media coverage and about Palestine, started writing in with their own stories. Here are some of them. One person wrote to me, "I'm sorry you're being misrepresented like this." This is after the honest reporting thing. They wrote, "This group has come after Outlet several times, and their reading of our stories is always in such bad faith. I think the headache groups like this make for management is one of the reasons we don't cover this story enough outside of these huge outbreaks of violence, and why people therefore lack the context to understand what's happening. And that's clearly their intention." Another one read, "I'm constantly going between these two things, speaking the truth publicly with all of the principles of fairness and balance and empathy I've learned all these years as a journalist, and then cowering in fear of repercussions and what it would mean for my livelihood and my family." Another simply wrote, "It's straight up McCarthyism in some parts of the newsroom." Meanwhile, I was occasionally going to pro-Palestinian protests, anti-genocide protests. The broad range of people who showed up to these protests week after week was really something to behold and a story in and of itself. Children, Black people, Indigenous people, Jewish, queer, trans, Vietnamese, librarians, teachers, parents, Tamil. Even Spider-Man came out. It was especially significant to see a consistent Jewish presence at these protests. I've heard directly from many Jewish friends and colleagues about the rifts this time has brought out in their families and relationships, the isolation they're facing, the estrangement. I salute them for their courage. But things are changing, it seems. This is the front cover of the latest issue of the Canadian Jewish News, out just a few days ago. In it, people are gathered around a table, and notably, one of them is wearing a Palestinian kufiyya and watermelon earrings, while another wears a pin for the hostages. One person on Twitter wrote, "As an anti-Zionist Jew who went to Jewish day school, grew up in Zionist-only spaces, and always had the CJN in the house, I promise this matters. Jews are not a monolith, and the mainstream Jewish publication being willing to at least reckon with that is meaningful." In a way, I think this time we've all been trying to find meaning, community. Last February, I co-organized, along with a team of journalists, a vigil held at Toronto Metropolitan University for journalists who've been killed in Palestine, Lebanon, and Israel, the vast majority of them Palestinian. We received funding for this from the InSpirit Foundation. With that money, we bought flowers, candles, and a poster we had printed with all the names of the journalists who'd been killed. At the time, the number of journalists was 85 journalists and media workers confirmed dead, 78 Palestinian, 4 Israeli, 3 Lebanese. Today, the Committee to Protect Journalists puts that number at 116. Palestinian estimates are higher, but 111 Palestinian, 2 Israeli, and 3 Lebanese. They also noted that at least, this is the Committee to Protect Journalists, at least 5 Palestinian journalists were directly targeted by Israeli forces in killings the CPJ itself classifies as murder. You know, for this vigil, we emailed editors and newsroom leaders at every news outlet in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, inviting them to cover it, pleading with them to allow their journalists to come without fear of discipline or punishment. In the end, not a single mainstream outlet showed up. Their reporters did, to attend as journalists. One thing we heard that day was just the lack of community, how good it felt to just acknowledge this with fellow journalists. You know who did show up to cover it? The student press. The Eye Opener, the Review of Journalism, On the Record, showed up, bore witness, interviewed us, documented it for their papers. This echoes a trend I've noticed over the last few months. While mainstream news outlets are skittish and reluctant to cover Palestine, younger student journalists, including many who covered encampments on their own campuses, have been leading the way. Yes. It's worth noting that even the most well-known writers, thank you for sticking with me. I know this has been going on for a little bit. I'm almost done here. Thank you for your attention. It's worth noting that even the most well-known writers and intellectuals are not immune from apparent censorship on Palestine. Earlier this month, prolific Indian author and Weston International Award recipient Pankaj Mishra shared that the Globe and Mail removed 17 references to Israel in an essay that he submitted on the occasion of his prize. I wanted to show just how many people came out to this vigil. It was very well attended. This piece came out just a few weeks ago. Pankaj Mishra, I went to his award ceremony, and in it he spoke unflinchingly to a full house of listeners at the event in Toronto and talked about this removal by the Globe and Mail. As he closed his remarks, he received a standing ovation for speaking about what many of us in the room have been longing to discuss, plainly, openly, and together. In an interview with The Breach, where you see a picture there, he said, "I'm very strongly inclined to believe that this was a political decision to not carry criticism of Israel." I reached out to the Globe for comment on this. Here's part of how they responded. Quote, "The Globe and Mail was promised by the Writers' Trust a short, original essay from Mr. Mishra. Instead, the paper was sent a draft of a nearly 5,000-word speech he was to deliver in Toronto. One of our editors attempted to capture the thrust of what he had been told Mr. Mishra wanted to write about, on why we need to listen to the Global South to help solve the world's most pressing problems, while having to cut the text practically in half in order to meet our space requirements. Our edit had absolutely nothing to do with criticism of Israel." End quote. Though there is much to critique, I also want to nod to some excellent work that's been happening over the last year. To me, there's never been a more crucial time for strong, independent journalism. And in Canada, we have some really good examples. I've played a lot of them for you today or shown some screenshots. I've been following reporting myself from Dave Gray-Donald and the team at The Grind, Jeremy Apple's work at The Maple, Scott Martin at The Catch, Samiria Moyedin, on the line, her outlet is called On the Line Media. She's a former CBC colleague of mine. She's done one-of-a-kind, near-daily coverage of the encampments at U of T. There is also great work happening at mainstream institutions. I want to acknowledge that at CBC, I've been following the great work of reporter Evan Dyer, one of the few, if only, senior mainstream Canadian journalists doing consistently stellar work on Palestine and Israel since October 7th, with a focus, crucially, on how it intersects with international law, Canadian domestic politics, and foreign policy. My former CBC colleague Yasmin Hassan has been doing incredible reporting on life in Gaza, often in collaboration with local journalists on the ground there. CBC reporter Brishti Basu wrote an incredible piece for the CBC detailing, quote, "many instances across Canada in which employees, students have faced firing, suspensions, or calls for them not to be hired based on their publicly stated political stance on the Israel-Hamas war." Soon after that piece's publication, her contract at the CBC was cut short. I'm painfully aware that every time I talk about our shortcomings when covering Palestine and now the alarming killing of Palestinian journalists, I lose credibility. This fear of being seen as biased used to affect me. I bowed to it for too long. I silently agreed not to talk about Palestine in exchange for a viable career in journalism. What is that? What's a viable? Sorry, that's a joke for the journalists. It's been tough. It's been a tough time. No longer. Last October, I heard Nobel Prize-winning journalist Maria Ressa speak at Harvard University as part of the Neiman Foundation's 85th anniversary celebration. Addressing an auditorium of the best journalists in the world, she said, quote, "Journalists are the punching bag when democracy is fighting for its life." Ressa advised us all in the room that day to face our fears, because only by doing so can we remove their sting. Today, it's Palestinian journalists who've become that punching bag. Their blue press vests and helmets have seemingly turned them into walking targets. I'm here today because I'd like to create an environment in Canada where we can actually talk about that, where Palestinian journalists don't feel like they have to pretend not to be Palestinian, not to care about the fate of their people in order to make it. As I address our industry with these questions and critiques, I must begin with myself. For too long, I've internalized the lesson that in order to keep my place in the business, I must tiptoe around this story. I'm under no illusion that we're going to stop the Palestine exception today, but I want us to get more comfortable talking, sharing, and acknowledging it exists. Over the years, almost every journalist I've spoken to, and perhaps many of you in the room, can remember the exact moment where you learned not to touch this story. It is a press freedom issue. Those who do talk about it are targeted because there are so few of us who do. With that, if you feel that you have been impacted by this issue, please submit an incident report to the Canada Press Freedom Project. It was founded by JSource in 2022 to provide data surrounding freedom of the press and has an ongoing quantitative database of press freedom violations in Canada. You can submit an incident on their website, which is canadapressfreedom.ca. In preparing this talk, I've thought through all the worst-case scenarios that will come from me speaking here tonight. I'll never get a job in media again. No one's going to want to work with me. I won't be able to continue making a living as an independent journalist. I believe many of us in whatever industry are feeling this weight. Here's Booker Prize-winning Indian author Arundhati Roy. She wrote, "The only moral thing Palestinian civilians can do, apparently, is to die. The only legal thing the rest of us can do is to watch them die and be silent. If not, we risk our scholarships, our grants, lecture fees, livelihoods. And while many of us, myself included, worry about losing our livelihoods, the worst possible thing that can happen to us, I want to remind us what the worst thing is for Palestinians right now. They are losing their lives. Their families are losing their lives, sometimes at home, sleeping. That worst thing has been happening at an alarming, historic, unprecedented rate. And it happened to Shireen Abu Akleh before them. I know the word martyr makes some people in the West uncomfortable, but I believe Shireen died as one. In Arabic, the word martyr actually is shaheed. Literally translated in Arabic, shaheed means witness, and Shireen died as a witness. I'm incredibly honored to have gotten to speak about her at Carleton, home of the Shireen Abu Akleh Emerging Reporter Award today. To close, I want to read a tribute to Shireen that was written by her brother, Tony, and her niece, Lena. We invited them to share something with us at the vigil, and it was read by Shireen Salti, a family friend who's her namesake. Here is part of what Shireen read about Shireen that day. Shireen was the eyes and ears of the Palestinian people, spreading the message of their daily struggles under occupation. She chose journalism because she wanted to be close to the people, and she did so by entering the hearts and homes of every Palestinian through a small TV screen. Young women and girls grew up aspiring to become journalists like Shireen because she shattered the gender norms and paved the way. The soldier that killed her and the system responsible haven't been held accountable yet. More than a year and a half later, we continue to pursue justice and accountability through any avenue available. Israel's assassination of Shireen falls into a long-standing and well-documented pattern of targeting and inciting against Palestinian journalists, and all journalists for that matter. Today, as we bear witness to the genocide being committed in Gaza, we must remember and honor the lives of the journalists and media workers killed by the Israeli army. They tried to silence Shireen, but she continues to be remembered every day, every month. With all of these events, honoring her legacy, it shows that she is still among us. We urge you all to never stop talking about Shireen, a journalist icon. We call for justice for Shireen and all the journalists killed in Palestine for exercising their right to press and for simply reporting the truth. Journalism is not a crime, and killing journalists, but killing journalists is. And it is long overdue for Israel to be held accountable. Thank you all for listening today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for this essay. Thank you for staying up until 5 o'clock in the morning to write, and for working on this for days and days now, so weeks. Thank you so much. I would like to introduce 3 executive members of the Student-Led Association for Equity and Inclusion in Journalism and Media, and have you all come up. Carmela Karangan, Alyssa Mendes, and Rachel Kwok. This is a student-led organization that is working behind the scenes to advocate for all matters related to equity and inclusion in the classroom and in the journalism schools community. They are currently planning town halls for this year to hear students' concerns and make sure that faculty hears them as well. Carmela, Rachel, and Alyssa will pose some questions to Pacinthe, and I am aware of time, so we might not ask all the questions that we had planned. I will also look in at the questions you've sent us, and I will try to pose one on behalf of all of us. But I think that first we might turn to Carmela.
All right. First, it's nice meeting you. Thank you for having the talk here today. I just wanted to ask, if you were starting out today, what would you do differently?
What would I do differently? Oh, yes. The microphone. Did you know that as journalists, we need microphones to speak? What would I do differently? It's a great question. I don't know that I would do anything differently. I feel like I showed up as myself. I feel like I worked really hard, and I hit the limits of what it is to show up fully in journalism. So I don't know that I would change anything about what I did. I know that's a little bit of a cop-out, but I'm just thinking that in this situation, I don't know that I could have done something different to avoid this outcome. Sorry, it's a little bit of a cop-out.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask, what is your advice for early career journalists looking to offer compassionate, balanced coverage of Palestinian issues?
There's this quote that I'm going to not do a good job of quoting specifically, but it says something like, when you want to tell a story, go where the blood is still flowing. And I think I would just say follow your empathy. I feel like empathy has been beaten out of us as journalists, and specifically on this issue, I would say. But also do your journalism. Bring bring sources that are well regarded. Bring, what the ICJ is doing. Bring what the United Nations is doing. Talk about what Reporters Without Borders is doing. But fundamentally tell human stories. And I often feel, we talk about this word dehumanization a lot. And often I alluded to this in my conversation, but get beyond the numbers. Tell stories about individual people. And, one thing that I remember is that I think as journalists, we think that when we pitch something once, it's just going to go forward. But, I think the journalists in the room know what it's like to have to pitch something over and over again. I think we inherit a lot of messages about what you can and can't pitch by what's approved because we want to get our stories on the air. But I also think there's power in persistence. I used to love, when I was at CBC, having a story rejected just for me to come the next day and pitch it again, but with a little something, And oftentimes it worked. Don't internalize the lack of interest on this story. Keep at it. If it's something that you care about, if you're finding human stories, if it's something that you're thinking about, and find interesting ways of telling it. But at the end of the day, tell human stories, stay persistent, and make sure that you're doing work that is, verifiable, balanced, and I'd say center Palestinians, because they are so rarely centered.
Thank you.
I have a question from the audience. There's so many questions, thank you. What are your fears and hopes for how Canadian media will cover what is happening in Lebanon now?
Oof, this is tough because I think what's happening in Lebanon now is almost a direct spillover of our inability to cover what's happening in Gaza properly. You all remember the pager attacks in Lebanon like a couple of weeks ago. Did you see what some of the media was saying about these attacks, the words that were being used? I was watching my friends in Lebanon evacuate. I have friends that are pleading with their mother right now in Lebanon to come to Canada. They're so worried for her. I have friends who've just evacuated to Jordan. I'm watching stories of migrant workers in Lebanon, predominantly African, who have been abandoned, have nowhere to go. It's a catastrophe. It is a human catastrophe. But the headlines that I was reading talked about what's happening in these pager attacks as sophisticated, movie-like. I was like, what is sophisticated about pagers blowing up? I read one report in, I forget what outlet, I'm so sorry, but one of the reports was that one of these pagers exploded in a pediatrician's office with a 10-month-old baby on the table. So I would hope that media, even though we clearly have not been doing a good job on this, can tell the story through the lens of Lebanese people and not through whatever sophisticated warfare they are praising. The New York Times just days ago put out a quiz. Did anyone see this? So days after the pager attacks, I forget what the death toll is now in Lebanon, but I think it's over 600 people.
It's 1,200.
1,200.
And counting. Yeah, no borders.
Meantime, the New York Times put out a quiz that was like, in what year did the first Lebanese war start?
No, it was... Sorry.
No, please tell me. I'm sorry.
Since when this day is the deadliest day in Lebanon since, and then you had 4 options.
Yes.
Which is,
Yeah.
And one of them was since the end of the Lebanese Civil War.
So
you had to pick, how many deadly, horrific days is Lebanon.
I'd ask you to imagine if something was happening in center town. I was just in Montreal, in the Mont-Royal area. In Toronto, I live on the Danforth. If 6 blocks of residential buildings were bombed in any of these places, would we run a quiz in our media about when the first Canadian, I don't even know there's no parallel actually. Our coverage is often lacking humanity. This is not new, I'm really not saying anything new, but Arabs, many people, Arabs, Black people, Indigenous people are so rarely afforded humanity, the ability to grieve. And it is kind of like this kind of ping-pong journalism. So it's hard to say what the lesson should be on Lebanon because I feel like we missed the boat on Gaza, but at the end of the day, There are actual people. Think of the ways that we can name specific victims of things that have happened here in Canada. We know their names, we know their faces, we know their stories. But all we get is, these breathless accounts of how sophisticated this pager attack was. We've lost our humanity often in journalism, and I think we need to do a better job of that, especially towards people who rarely get afforded that.
Rachel, you have a question about inside of our classrooms, and
Yeah, so thank you so much for your talk today. It was really interesting to listen to you speak. So with Israeli and Palestinian students sharing the same spaces, how can a journalistic education environment create spaces that are open to these conversations?
That's a really good question. And I think actually educational spaces and classrooms are actually one of the best places to have these conversations. I forget who I was saying this to, but the conversations that I'm trying to have now are not, I don't want to say they're not happening. I think it's much more challenging to have them in newsrooms, with management, with leadership. And I say that, I'm not trying to demonize anyone. I remember I used to, was part of a team that was running one of the biggest shows in Canada at the time. There's no time to talk about things. We're on deadline, we're busy, the world does not wait. What you have in educational spaces, and I think part of the reason I'm here is because it is an educational space, there is an openness, there is an ability to actually talk and discuss. And I also actually want to maybe push back on the premise a little bit, though I know why you're asking, but I think often the story, this is one of the things that I wanted to talk about in my presentation, but we would have been here till 10, but I took it out. The very first story that I covered as a student journalist, it was actually the first time I'd ever come face to face with an Israeli person. I'd only seen them in the news, and I was a student journalist at TMU, and I got invited to cover a festival called Voices Forward Festival. And it was a festival showcasing Jewish and Palestinian and Israeli voices through arts and culture. And I was offered a duo, an Israeli and Palestinian duo, who were actually working together to document life in Hebron, or Khalil, a very deeply segregated city. So I raised that because it was, it was game-changing for me, and this is where I think journalism is most beautiful. My paradigm shifted when I saw that there were Israelis who were working hand in hand with Palestinians, that Israelis were invested in ending the occupation. I met with a former Israeli soldier who was now working with B'Tselem, a human rights organization. When I went home to my parents that year, they were living in Kuwait at the time. I've always been trying to wrangle my way into conversations with my dad, because you go to the big cookouts and the family gatherings and all the men are talking very loudly about politics and religion, and I've only ever wanted to be with my dad in those spaces, and I would try so hard to have everyone listen to me, but they talked over me because the Arab uncles are very loud. But when I told them the story about meeting the Israeli soldier, about meeting the Israeli that was working with the Palestinian and documenting life in Hebron, it was as quiet as it was in this room right now. And that's very quiet for a room full of 40 Arab uncles. So I want to, I think I'm getting away from your central question, but I just think that educational spaces are gems of a place. And I think it's in spaces like these where we can actually have conversations. I'm not, a professional teacher or instructor, but I think there are probably really wonderful ways of getting people to engage thoughtfully, meaningfully, using technology. I loved when I was at CBC producing town halls, places where we could talk openly and have dialogue. Maybe a classroom could have a little town hall, have people share their experiences. At the end of the day, everyone just wants to be heard. And I think educational spaces have a really important role to play in that. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Amel, you had a question about sort of preparing for tonight.
Right. How did you go about framing this talk, knowing that other journalists may view this as undermining their work?
Ooh. Yeah, I'll be honest. I don't know. I'll be honest, because this is part of the problem of talking about this, is that by definition, you are going to be talking about your peers, your colleagues, I've named some places and people that I've, worked with. Although I try as a rule not to name people unless I'm praising their work. I try to do more of a systemic analysis. But I think, as journalists and as colleagues in journalism, we have to be able to look each other in the face and have conversations even when we disagree. We have to be able to look each other in the face and say, here's why I made that decision. But often on this issue specifically, it's happened to me multiple times. They cannot give you an answer. They cannot look you in the face and say, this is what happened. The collegiality flies out the window. I would like for this to be, I know it, I would like this to be a calling in. I'm actually not particularly invested in, I would much rather be writing and doing other things, I'll be very honest with you. I wish I had my phone with me. I have a picture of Rihanna on my phone. I would much rather be doing stories about Rihanna. I would much rather be writing stories about love and relationships and modern womanhood. But I feel like we have to learn how to have difficult conversations in media without shutting down, disciplining, punishing, and shutting people out. So I would like to see this as a calling in. And, you asked me how I prepared for this. Like I said, I'll be honest, I was up past 5 a.m. today. I have been, Nanaba knows this, the last few weeks have been very tough because I'm like, how do I talk about this while being honest, being critical, but also, and I hope, anyone listening, I hope there's been a spirit of fairness. I asked the Globe for comment. I showed the good parts of my Canada Land interview. I praised some CBC colleagues. Like, I'm truly not out to get people. I think this is a situation that all of us have to work on. I am not perfect. I'm actually bracing. I'm like kind of scared to check my phone. Like, I don't even know what the reaction is going to be. I'm a little worried. But I hope, and I hope people listening to this know that this is coming from a place of urgency, because our failures on covering this are literally getting journalists killed in Gaza. And I would venture to say, I feel like I've been hiding behind, we have to care about journalists. If you care about Palestinian journalists, then you care about Palestinian people. You know what I mean? Journalism for me has been a mechanism to say, if we care about the journalists that we call our colleagues and peers, then why don't we care about those people too? So I hope that when people are watching this, I'm sure I've upset a few people, but I really want this to be an opening, a calling in, and I want this to be a little bit of a litmus test for how we can have difficult conversations in media. I'm not here to say that we have solved anti-Black racism in media or anti-Indigenous racism in media or homophobia but we can name it. We can say, oh, here's where our coverage fell short. Oh, can we do a training on this so that we know how to talk about this better? Can we fail safely? We haven't figured out how to do that on this issue. All we get is sidelining, disciplining, shutdowns, and people losing their jobs or being thwarted. So it really stumped me how to talk about this without ruffling some feathers. But as journalists, don't we just love ruffling feathers? Isn't that what we do? We love the rabble-rousers in other industries, but when we do it ourselves, it's, and I'm really not trying to be a rabble-rouser. Anyway, as you can tell, I'm like literally in real time, being like, I'm not mad at anyone, I just want us to do better. And I hope that this is what the spirit of this talk has been.
Alyssa, your last question?
Yeah, you talked tonight about walking a lonely road. I'm wondering how you sustain and protect yourself as you do this challenging work.
I'm gonna cry. I have really good friends. Oh, I hate that I'm crying. But this is part of it. I have very good friends. Some of them are sitting in the front row. You know, I talked about voice notes earlier. I sent Professor Nanaba Duncan, Cardi Chair in Journalism, Diversity, and Inclusion Studies, creator of the Marianne Chet Carey Center for Journalism and Belonging, Nanaba is a friend, a peer. I send Nanaba 50,000 voice notes a day.
And I listen to everyone.
Yes. And Nanaba knows my every silly thought. She knows my fears. I am so lucky to have so many people that I can speak openly and honestly and vulnerably to. I have family here from Dubai, family in the Arab sense. We're all family, but you know, I have Mahmoud and Mimi and Suzanne and Amr Husseini and Felix, who I just met today. We went to school together in Dubai. The longevity of these relationships, being friends. You know, one thing I have to say, like, I started caring about Palestine not because I have a moral. I cared about Palestine because I have Palestinian friends. I learned empathy because I cared. I didn't know. And again, I'm sure someone's going to be like, oh, you said this date wrong today. I'm ready for it. I'm ready to be fact checked. But I cared about Palestine because I have Palestinian friends. I watched the news in the Middle East. Palestinians were on the news regularly. It was not a big thing. So, sorry, I'm getting away from the question. I have a lot of support. My parents always taught me to speak the truth. My dad has been very encouraging on this. I'll be honest, my mom tells me to stop talking about this sometimes. She worries for me. For a long time, she's worried for me. She's very proud of me, but she worries about the risks. But today she said, go, you're going to do a great job. So I've kind of shifted my focus away from the top of leadership at journalism organizations. These days, what sustains me is my peers, my friends, people that I can speak honestly and openly and be my full self with. And I feel so lucky that I have so many people that I get to do that with. And honestly, 1000% would not be able to do this. I've said to Nanaba multiple times, I don't think I would be here today if she wasn't here, because I just felt such a safety. I've also met, I've worked with Duncan, I've met Alan before. There seems to be a permissive safety here, and I think that's what enables me to keep going. And I'm grateful that I have that level of support, because not everyone does.
Rachel, you're going to ask the last question, and I know that this is a last question of the night. We are over time. Thank you so much for being here, but Rachel, go ahead.
Okay, so over time we've seen that journalism is a very white-dominated profession, but we're very blessed to have 4 women of color on this stage right now. So, what do you hope to see for this industry in 10 years, and how do you think we can get there?
That's a wonderful question. I would like, we talk about diversity a lot, and I would like for diversity to be more than decorative. I want us, all of you, to be able to occupy positions of real editorial power. I feel like in my 15 years of journalism so far, what I see is a lot of talk about change, but what changes is the very outer rung, maybe the little mushy middle, but the core part of where power is, where editorial leadership is, where hiring and firing is, where job stability is, often precludes us, often does not include us. And we hit that wall. And I think the reality is we need a new wave of people to occupy those spaces, but that means that someone has to make way. We can't diversity decoration our way out of this. Power and decision making really needs to change to be able to be in your hands, in your hands, in your hands. But that's not us. That's not us. It's like, what can we do? What can we do? Like, there's only so much we can do. At a certain point, you need someone to say, we're gonna give you this job. We're gonna trust you with an editorial leadership. Listen, we've all made mistakes. Who, as a journalist, who's not made a mistake? I can't say that. I failed my first journalism assignment, as I told you. There's people who are allowed to fail and stay, and there's people who have to be excellent consistently and yet still not be able to make it. So I want the power dynamic to shift, and I'm talking about at the top, and what it means is that people at the top have to give way and have to cede power for us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We are going to close up the evening. Thank you all so much for being here. Is there anything at the close that you want to say?
Just thank you all so much for staying. Like, I was expecting people to slowly trickle out of the room, but I'm like amazed that so many of you have stayed. It means so much to me that you listened on this issue, and I want to thank the school here. I think Carleton is really exemplifying leadership, and I would like to think that this is maybe the beginning of a conversation that is really needed. And I'm so happy to be part of it in this really meaningful and very special way today. So thank you for the invitation.